Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your bank account is frozen. Your job no longer pays in a currency anyone accepts. The grocery store shelves are thinning, and the government tells you, this is not a crisis, this is policy. Now imagine that happening to an entire nation. 85 million people for over 4 decades. This is the story of Iran's economy. Not the story that gets told in sanctions press releases or in revolutionary speeches from Tehran. The real story of how a country survives being cut off from the world and what that survival actually costs. To understand where Iran is today, you have to understand what it was before the revolution. And what it was, for a brief window in the 20th century, was something close to a rising power. Under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, Iran in the 1960s and 1970s was undergoing one of the most dramatic economic transformations in the developing world. The Shah called it the White Revolution, a program of land reform, industrialization, literacy, and modernization driven almost entirely by oil revenue. Between 1963 and 1977, Iran's GDP grew at an average annual rate of around 10%. Per capita income quadrupled. Tehran was being rebuilt as a modern metropolis. Iranian engineers were studying at MIT. Iranian pilots were flying F-14 Tomcats. By the mid-1970s, Iran was the second largest oil exporter in OPEC. The Shah was purchasing nuclear reactors from Germany and France, not in secret, but openly, with American blessing. Western powers saw Iran as a pillar of regional stability, a gendarmerie of the Persian Gulf. The economy was deeply dependent on oil. Roughly 80% of government revenue came from petroleum exports. Everything else, manufacturing, agriculture, services, existed in the shadow of the oil sector. This was classic resource curse territory. A country growing rich without growing strong. And underneath the prosperity, pressure was building. The Shah's modernization program had created a new, educated middle class, a class that wanted political rights to match their economic expectations. His secret police, Savak, ensured they didn't get them. Income inequality was extreme. Rural communities had been disrupted by land reform without being adequately supported. The religious establishment, led from exile by Ayatollah Khomeini, saw in the Shah's Western-aligned secularizing revolution a war against Iranian identity itself. In January 1979, the Shah boarded a plane and never came back. The Islamic Republic that replaced him inherited something extraordinary. One of the most developed economies in the Middle East, a functioning bureaucracy, a trained professional class, and enormous oil wealth. What it did with that inheritance is one of the great economic tragedies of the modern world. The early years of the Islamic Republic were defined not by economic planning, but by political survival. The revolution had to be consolidated. Enemies had to be eliminated. The revolution had to be exported. The first act of economic transformation was nationalization. Banks, large industries, and, most importantly, the oil sector, all of it brought under state control. Foreign capital fled. Western companies that had built infrastructure under the Shah packed up overnight. Iranian technocrats who had managed these industries were purged, jailed, or executed. Then came the hostage crisis. In November 1979, revolutionary students seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 diplomats hostage for 444 days. The United States, under President Carter, froze approximately $12 billion in Iranian assets and imposed its first major economic sanctions. It was a preview of what would become Iran's permanent condition. But nothing compared to what came next. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran. What followed was 8 years of industrialized slaughter, the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Trench warfare, chemical weapons used on Iranian soldiers and civilians, 1 million dead. The economy ground down to the bone. The Iran-Iraq War was, economically speaking, a catastrophe from which Iran has never fully recovered. Khuzestan province, the heart of Iran's oil infrastructure, was a front line. Oil export capacity was devastated. The port of Abadan, once the site of the world's largest oil refinery, was destroyed. Agricultural land was contaminated. Entire cities, Khorramshahr, Avaz, Dezful, were bombed into rubble. Iran financed the war by printing money. Inflation exploded. The private sector, already strangled by post-revolutionary nationalizations and revolutionary committees that seized private property, effectively ceased to function as an engine of growth. What remained was a war economy, centralized, inefficient, ideologically suspicious of profit. When the ceasefire finally came in 1988, Iran was exhausted, not just militarily, institutionally. The generation that had built the pre-revolutionary economy was gone, dead, exiled, or marginalized. A new ruling class had emerged: clerics, revolutionary guards, Bazari merchants with regime connections. The economy reflected their interests, not those of the nation. Sanctions against Iran did not arrive all at once. They were constructed layer by layer over decades, each new layer added in response to a specific Iranian action or American political moment. The first serious economic sanctions came with the hostage crisis in 1979. Then, in 1987, the Reagan administration banned imports of Iranian goods in response to Iranian support for terrorism. In 1995, President Clinton signed executive orders prohibiting American companies from doing business with Iran entirely, including in the oil sector. In 1996, Congress passed the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which went further, threatening penalties against foreign companies that invested more than $40 million in Iran's energy sector. This was extraterritorial jurisdiction. America was not just sanctioning Iran, it was telling the entire world, do business with Iran, and you will face consequences in American markets. This was the beginning of what would become the most sophisticated financial weapons system in human history. Over the following 2 decades, the architecture expanded. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, developed an intricate web of designations. Iranian entities, individuals, banks, shipping companies, and front corporations were listed. Any foreign financial institution that processed transactions for designated entities risked losing access to the US dollar clearing system, which is to say, access to global finance itself. Because nearly all international trade is denominated in US dollars, and because dollar transactions must pass through American correspondent banks, the United States acquired extraordinary leverage over the global economy. Banks in Tokyo, Frankfurt, Dubai, and Mumbai could not afford to lose dollar access. One by one, they stopped doing business with Iran, not because they were legally required to, but because the risk was too great. Iran was being cut out of the international financial system not through any single dramatic act, but through the slow, methodical tightening of 10,000 small restrictions. The nuclear issue brought the structure to its apex. After years of escalation over Iran's nuclear program, the Obama administration coordinated something unprecedented: multilateral sanctions supported by the United Nations Security Council. In 2012, Iran was effectively cut off from the SWIFT international banking messaging system, the infrastructure that connects global financial institutions. Without SWIFT, Iran couldn't receive international wire transfers, couldn't collect payment for oil, couldn't pay for imports. Oil exports, which had already dropped significantly due to U.S. pressure, collapsed further. In 2011, Iran was exporting roughly 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. By 2013, that number had fallen below 1.1 million barrels per day. Government revenue fell off a cliff. The Iranian Rial, already weakening, entered freefall. This was peak sanctions pressure. And it worked. At least, it brought Iran to the negotiating table.
There is something philosophically disorienting about watching a country's money die. In 2011, $1 was worth approximately 10,000 Iranian rials. By 2018, it was worth 140,000 rials. By 2020, during COVID, the exchange rate had passed 300,000 rials to the dollar. Today, unofficial exchange rates hover somewhere around 600,000 rials to a single US dollar. That is a collapse of roughly 98% of the currency's value in a decade. To understand what this means in human terms, consider an Iranian civil servant earning a monthly salary that seemed reasonable in 2010 now earns, in real purchasing power, something close to nothing. Savings accumulated over a lifetime to buy a house, to educate children, to retire, evaporated. Not in a single crisis, but in a slow, grinding, daily attrition. Hyperinflation of this scale doesn't just make things expensive. It restructures society. It transfers wealth from anyone who holds savings, ordinary people, the middle class, to anyone who holds hard assets, real estate, gold, foreign currency, physical goods. Those with access to dollars thrive. Those without are crushed. Iran's inflation has hovered between 40% and 60% in recent years, with some economists putting the real figure significantly higher. The official inflation statistics produced by Iran's central bank are widely regarded as unreliable. The government's response has been a classic rentier state improvisation: price controls, multiple exchange rate systems, subsidies, and currency rationing. For decades, the Iranian government maintained an artificial official exchange rate, dramatically stronger than the market rate, used for imports of essential goods like medicine and food. The gap between the official rate and the free market rate created an obvious opportunity for corruption. Connected individuals could obtain dollars at the official rate and sell them on the black market at the market rate, pocketing the difference. This practice became known as currency arbitrage and enriched a generation of regime-connected intermediaries while draining state resources. The Rouhani administration, facing pressure from the IMF and reformist economists, attempted to unify the exchange rate system in 2018. The timing could not have been worse. Weeks later, Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the 2015 nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions with unprecedented severity. The Rial, briefly stabilized, crashed again. To understand Iran's economy, you must understand a simple fact. There are effectively two Iranian economies. One is the official economy, measurable, regulated, connected to government ministries and the central bank. The other is controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC was established in 1979 as the revolution's ideological vanguard military force, distinct from the regular army, which was considered unreliable. Over the decades, it expanded from a military organization into something without obvious parallel in the modern world. A military, intelligence, and economic conglomerate that controls an estimated 20 to 40% of Iran's GDP. The IRGC's economic empire is vast. Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters, the IRGC's engineering arm,
has won contracts for hundreds of major infrastructure projects: tunnels, dams, pipelines, bridges, railways, gas fields. It operates not through competitive bidding, but through no-bid contracts awarded by sympathetic ministries. Rival private companies cannot compete and have largely stopped trying. Beyond construction, IRGC-affiliated entities control ports, import networks, telecommunications, automotive manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and real estate development. The organization runs its own investment funds, its own media empire, and its own import channels, many of which bypass official customs entirely. This last point is critical. The IRGC controls significant portions of Iran's unofficial import infrastructure. Goods, consumer electronics, automobiles, petroleum products, luxury goods, enter Iran through IRGC-linked networks that pay reduced or no duties. This is not a side business. It is a structural feature of the Iranian economy. The organization that is supposed to defend the Islamic Republic is also, in significant ways, extracting rent from it. Sanctions have, paradoxically, strengthened the IRGC's economic position. As legitimate private sector companies were crushed by restrictions on international trade and finance, the IRGC's networks, operating outside formal channels, insulated from international scrutiny, filled the vacuum. Every sanction that targeted a formal Iranian bank or company pushed economic activity deeper into the shadow networks the IRGC controls. By the early 2000s, Western analysts were noting a bitter irony. The sanctions designed to pressure the Iranian government were, in many ways, pressure on everyone except the Revolutionary Guards.
Here is a number that should change how you think about Iran's sanctions. In 2023, Iran exported roughly 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. Officially, Iranian oil exports are sanctioned. The United States actively enforces these sanctions. Ships carrying Iranian oil are tracked. Companies caught handling Iranian crude face severe penalties. And yet, the oil moves. The answer is China. China is Iran's largest trading partner and, since approximately 2021, the de facto guarantor of the Iranian economy's survival. Chinese state enterprises and private refineries, particularly small and medium-sized teapot refineries in Shandong province, purchase Iranian oil at steep discounts, sometimes $30 to $40 below international benchmark prices. The discount is the price of sanctions risk. Iran accepts it because the alternative is no income at all. The logistics are elaborate. Iranian oil is transferred ship to ship in international waters, mixed with other crude to obscure its origin, stored in floating tankers, and then delivered to Chinese ports under doctored documentation describing it as crude of a different provenance. The vessels involved, what the U.S. Treasury calls the shadow fleet, operate under flags of convenience, with ownership structures routed through multiple jurisdictions to obscure beneficial ownership. The United States has designated hundreds of vessels, companies, and individuals involved in this trade. It has sanctioned Chinese teapot refineries. It has pressed Beijing diplomatically. None of it has stopped the fundamental flow. China has determined that access to discounted Iranian oil is worth the diplomatic friction with Washington. Beyond oil, China-Iran trade now spans a broad range of goods. Iranian petrochemicals, metals, and agricultural products move east. Chinese electronics, machinery, vehicles, and consumer goods move west, often through intermediary hubs in Dubai, Iraq, Turkey, and the UAE, which have become critical nodes in Iran's sanctions circumvention infrastructure. In 2021, Iran and China signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership described in Iranian state media as a historic document, dismissed in Western analysis as largely aspirational, but real in the sense that it formalized a relationship that had already become an economic lifeline. Russia, too, has deepened its economic ties with Iran since 2022, though the relationship is more limited in scope. The two sanctioned economies share technology, military cooperation, and some financial infrastructure, including connections to alternative payment systems designed to bypass the dollar system entirely. Iran's economy is not collapsing. It is surviving through a parallel globalization, a dark mirror of the international trading system running on discounts, deception, and the geopolitical calculation that China has more to gain from cheap Iranian oil than it has to lose from American displeasure.
Official policy and economic statistics do not capture what sanctions feel like inside Iran. So let us be specific. Medical sanctions are not supposed to exist. American sanctions on Iran have always formally exempted medicine and food from their scope. In practice, the exemption has consistently failed. International pharmaceutical companies, terrified of inadvertently violating sanctions or triggering secondary penalties, have refused to export to Iran. Iranian hospitals have faced shortages of basic drugs, antibiotics, cancer treatments, heart medications, immunosuppressants. Iranian patients requiring imported pharmaceuticals have died waiting for medicines stuck in bureaucratic limbo. Iranian economists and international human rights organizations have documented these effects for decades. The U.S. government has repeatedly insisted the exemptions are genuine. The gap between the formal policy and the operational reality is a measure of how blunt this instrument actually is. Food prices have surged. Wheat, cooking oil, chicken, staple goods have experienced price spikes of 200, 300, sometimes 400% over a decade. The government subsidizes basic goods, but the subsidies are poorly targeted, badly administered, and chronically underfunded. Food insecurity in a country that was, 40 years ago, an agricultural exporter is a measure of economic collapse with human consequences that no graph quite captures. The middle class, the doctors, engineers, academics, small business owners, and civil servants, who are the foundation of any stable society, has been largely destroyed. Iranian professionals earn salaries denominated in rials. Their savings are denominated in rials. Their expenses for imported goods, computers, cars, spare parts, medicines, are effectively denominated in dollars. The gap between their rial income and their dollar-cost reality has widened catastrophically. Those who could leave have left. Iran's brain drain is among the most severe in the world. Estimates suggest that between 150,000 and 180,000 educated Iranians emigrate every year. Doctors go to Canada, engineers go to Germany, scientists go to Australia and the United States. Every one of them represents not just a personal loss, but an institutional loss, training, institutional memory, human capital accumulated over decades and spent elsewhere. The people who cannot leave, the elderly, the poor, those without foreign language skills or foreign connections, absorb the full weight of the sanctions regime. They did not design Iran's nuclear program. They did not choose the IRGC's adventurism. They are paying for decisions made by a government they did not elect. This is the question the entire episode has been building toward. And the answer is genuinely complicated, which is to say, it depends entirely on what you think working means. If the goal of sanctions is to create economic pain, they have undeniably worked. The Iranian economy has contracted significantly. Ordinary Iranians are poorer, less healthy, and less hopeful than their counterparts in 1979. The currency has collapsed, investment has dried up, industrial capacity has degraded. The costs are real and measurable. If the goal of sanctions is to change Iranian government behavior on its core interests, the record is far more ambiguous. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, is often cited as the great success story of the sanctions as diplomacy approach. Iran agreed to restrict its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The architecture of economic pressure, the argument goes, worked. But consider what Iran agreed to. It accepted limits on uranium enrichment and inspection mechanisms. It did not dismantle its enrichment capability. It did not abandon its regional influence operations in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It did not fundamentally alter its relationship with militant proxies. The nuclear deal was real, but it was narrow. And when Trump withdrew from it in 2018, Iran responded not by complying, but by accelerating its nuclear program, enriching uranium to levels approaching weapons grade. The regime's survival calculus has not changed. The Islamic Republic in 45 years has faced revolution, war, economic siege, and popular uprisings. It has survived all of them. Its ruling class has developed a structural immunity to external economic pressure that is, in its way, remarkable. There is a reason for this. The people most harmed by sanctions, ordinary Iranians, have essentially no political mechanism to translate their suffering into policy change. Iran is not a democracy. Street protests have been met with bullets, imprisonment, and executions. The 2019 fuel price protests, which saw hundreds killed, produced no policy reversal. The 2022 Mahsa Amini uprising, the most significant challenge to the Islamic Republic in decades, was suppressed. The regime's inner circle, the Supreme Leader's Office, the IRGC, the inner political hierarchy, is substantially insulated from economic hardship. They have access to hard currency. They have access to imports. They do not eat subsidized bread. This is the central paradox of economic sanctions against authoritarian states. The pain falls on those with the least power to act on it, while those with the power to change policy bear the least pain. Western analysts, including some within the US government, have increasingly acknowledged this dynamic. Sanctions maximalism, the theory that if you simply tighten the screws hard enough, the regime will capitulate, has been tested on Iran for 4 decades without producing the fundamental policy changes it promised. What it has produced is a regime that has learned, with impressive ingenuity, how to survive being cut off from the world. A regime that has built parallel financial systems, cultivated alternative trade partners, weaponized economic suffering as nationalist narrative, and used sanctions as a convenient explanation for every domestic failure.
The Iranian economy, under 45 years of pressure, has evolved specific adaptations that are worth understanding on their own terms. Domestic production has been prioritized in sectors where import substitution is possible. Iran produces its own automobiles, not good ones, but functional ones. It produces its own pharmaceuticals, not all of them, but many. It has developed domestic drone manufacturing, missile production, and defense industries with a sophistication that surprises Western analysts who assumed sanctions would prevent it. It has developed a nuclear enrichment program under sanctions, not despite them. The petrochemical sector has been deliberately developed as a sanctions hedge. Unlike crude oil, heavy, easily identifiable, difficult to disguise, petrochemicals are a more sophisticated product, harder to trace, with broader global markets and more ambiguous end uses. Iran has invested heavily in turning its crude into plastics, fertilizers, and industrial chemicals that can be sold to a wider range of buyers. The informal economy has exploded. Bazaris, the traditional merchant class of Iran's covered markets, have always operated at the intersection of formal and informal commerce. Under sanctions, their expertise in currency exchange goods sourcing, and international intermediary networks became extraordinarily valuable. The Tehran Bazaar is not just a marketplace. It is one of the world's most sophisticated sanctions arbitrage systems. Cryptocurrency has emerged as an increasingly important tool. The Iranian government has officially endorsed cryptocurrency mining. Iran has significant electricity generation capacity from its gas reserves, and Iranian actors have used digital currencies to conduct some international transactions beyond the reach of SWIFT and US dollar controls. The blockchain does not distinguish between a sanctioned and an unsanctioned transaction. The Dubai Corridor is perhaps the most important physical node in Iran's sanctions circumvention infrastructure. The United Arab Emirates, and Dubai specifically, maintains close economic ties with the US-aligned Gulf security architecture. It also hosts the world's most active re-export economy. Iranian goods enter Dubai. Iranian goods leave Dubai as something else. Iranian importers receive Western goods through Emirati intermediaries. Estimates suggest that tens of billions of dollars in trade annually passes through this corridor. Trade that is nominally sanctions violating, routinely overlooked, and structurally essential to the Iranian economy. This is not a flaw in the sanctions architecture. It is the architecture functioning as it does in reality, with leakage, with workarounds, with the persistent reality that in a world of competing economic interests, no sanctions regime is airtight.
Here is where we are. Iran's economy is formally the 22nd largest in the world by purchasing power parity. It has a young, educated population, or at least it did before the brain drain. It has the world's second largest natural gas reserves and the fourth largest oil reserves. It has a sophisticated industrial base, a functioning university system, and domestic industries in steel, automobiles, textiles, and agriculture. It also has 40 years of accumulated damage. A currency worth a fraction of its former value. A private sector that cannot access international capital, cannot import freely, cannot export normally, and cannot plan rationally for a future it cannot predict. A healthcare system degraded by pharmaceutical shortages. A generation of talented young people who are choosing departure over the long grind of staying. The sanctions regime was built on a theory that economic pressure would eventually force a choice. The Iranian government would either change its behavior or face an economic crisis severe enough to threaten regime stability. Neither has fully materialized on the terms the theory predicted. What has materialized instead is something more complicated and more troubling. A partially isolated economy that has learned to survive isolation. A regime that has become expert at redirecting economic grievance toward external enemies, and an ordinary population that bears the cost of a confrontation it cannot resolve. The Islamic Republic has survived worse. It has survived revolution. It has survived a war that killed 1 million of its people. It has survived the collapse of its currency. It has found in China a partner large enough to keep the essential flows moving. Whether that constitutes a successful foreign policy on Tehran's part, or a failure of Western strategy, or simply the grinding reality of how durable authoritarian systems can be in the face of economic siege, that is a judgment that depends on what you believe the goal was. What we know is this: the sanctions didn't break Iran. They reshaped it into something harder, more self-sufficient in some ways, more dependent on shadowy networks in others, more resentful, and more convinced that the outside world is its enemy. Whether that outcome serves anyone's interests, Iranian, American, Israeli, or otherwise, is the question that the next episode will begin to answer. Because the nuclear program hasn't stopped. The enrichment continues. The weapons-grade threshold approaches. And the world is running out of time to find an answer that isn't a bomb. If this episode made you think differently about sanctions, about Iran, about the gap between policy and reality, then you already know someone else who needs to watch it. Share this video. Not for the algorithm, because these are conversations that don't happen enough. If you're new here, this is part of an ongoing series on Iran's place in the world, the diplomacy, the weapons, the history, and the human story behind the headlines. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if this kind of documentary work matters to you, like this video. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells YouTube that this content deserves to be seen. We'll see you in the next one.